The assembly hall on Salamis smelled of salt and desperation. Bodies pressed against bodies. Refugees who had lost everything, their homes reduced to cinders across the narrow strait where Athens once stood proud. In this cramped, makeshift council chamber, democracy still breathed, though barely. Lycidas rose. He was a reasonable man, by all accounts. A man who understood numbers and odds, who could read the writing that Persian fire had scrawled across the Athenian sky. When he lifted his hand to speak, the crowd fell silent, not from respect, but from exhaustion. Perhaps, he began, his voice measured, careful, we should consider what the Persians are offering. The word consider hung in the air like a wasp. There was no vote, no counter-argument, no eloquent rebuttal delivered by some silver-tongued orator. Instead, something far more primal erupted from the assembly, a collective roar that had been building for months, fermenting in the bellies of men who had watched their temples burn. The counselors nearest to Lycidas moved first. Stones appeared in hands. Where they came from, no one could later say. Perhaps they had been there all along, hidden in the folds of cloaks, waiting for this moment. The first blow struck Lycidas above the ear. He staggered. The second opened his scalp. By the fifth, he had stopped trying to speak. When word reached the women's quarter that their husbands had silenced a traitor, they did not weep. They did not turn away in horror. Instead, they gathered their own stones, their own rage, and marched to Lycidas's house. His wife heard them coming. His children had just enough time to scream. By nightfall, 4 bodies lay cooling in the Salamis dust, and something fundamental had shifted in the Greek soul. The careful scales of civilization, deliberation, mercy, the sacred bond between speaker and audience had been smashed against the rocks alongside Lycidas's skull. This was no longer a war of territories or tribute. This was annihilation, and the Greeks had finally accepted its terms. King Xerxes had departed Greece like a man fleeing a burning building, leaving behind only ashes and his most dangerous general. Mardonius remained, and Mardonius was patient. Where Xerxes had been spectacle, Mardonius was substance. Where the King of Kings had marched with 1 million mouths to feed, his general commanded something far more lethal. A refined instrument of 300,000 professional killers. The conscripts and camp followers had been sent home. What remained was muscle without fat. The immortals with their wicker shields and iron discipline. The Saka horse archers who could split a man's eye from 200 paces while riding at full gallop. Cavalry so numerous they seemed less like an army than a natural disaster. Mardonius sat in the burned shell of Athens, turning a gold cup in his weathered hands. They hide on their island, his aide reported, and argue among themselves. Let them argue, Mardonius smiled, a thin, patient thing. Let them remember what we did to their city. Then let them watch me do it again. He gave the order casually, as if requesting a second serving of wine. Burn whatever remained. The work crews set about their task with systematic efficiency. Walls that had survived the first invasion were pulled down stone by stone. Temples were defiled, their sacred images dragged into the streets and smashed. When they finally departed Athens, they left behind nothing but a graveyard of broken architecture, a clear message carved in rubble. I am still here, and I can wait forever. The Athenian refugees on Salamis received the news in silence. Some wept. Others simply stared across the water at the smoke still rising from their violated home. But the Athenian ambassadors who arrived in Sparta that same week did not come to weep. They came with a knife. The Spartan ephors received the Athenian delegation in the usual manner, standing expressionless, their red cloaks catching the afternoon light like dried blood. They expected pleading. They expected the usual Athenian eloquence, all honeyed words about Greek brotherhood. What they received was a threat. "You have walls," the lead ambassador said, his voice flat. "The isthmus protects you. You believe you can wait out this storm behind your fortifications while the rest of Greece burns." The eldest ephor began to speak, but the Athenian raised his hand. "We are not finished. Listen carefully, because I will say this only once." He stepped closer, close enough that the guards shifted uncomfortably. The Athenian fleet is the largest naval force in the Greek world. Right now, those ships sit idle at Salamis, crewed by men who have lost everything: their homes, their temples, their families' graves. These men have nothing left to lose. He paused, letting the silence do its work. If Sparta does not march within the week, those ships will sail to meet the Persian fleet, not to fight them, to join them. And when the combined navy of Athens and Persia sails south to the Peloponnese, your pretty walls at the isthmus will mean precisely nothing. The chamber had gone very still. "The choice," the ambassador concluded, "is yours." The ephors deliberated for less than an hour. What emerged from that closed session was not a compromise or a counteroffer. It was the entirety of Spartan military might, awakened and mobilized in a single explosive night. 5,000 Spartiates suited up in bronze that still held the polish of recent drilling. But Sparta had never been just its citizen warriors. For every armored knight, 7 helots were issued weapons and ordered to march. 35,000 bondsmen who tended Spartan fields now pressed into service as light infantry. Javelin throwers, baggage carriers, and, when necessary, human shields. Add the 5,000 perioikoi from surrounding Laconian towns, and the column that slipped out of the Peloponnese before dawn numbered 45,000 souls. When the Athenian ambassadors woke the next morning, already composing the angry speech they planned to deliver, an ephor stopped them at the door. "You can save your breath," he said, checking the position of the sun. "Our army crossed the border 4 hours ago. By tonight, they will be halfway to Boeotia." The ambassador stared. "The hunt," the ephor added, almost smiling, "has begun." Mardonius learned of the Spartan mobilization from his scouts while breaking his fast. He did not panic. He did not order an immediate assault on the mountain passes. Instead, he set down his bread, wiped his hands on a linen cloth, and began to laugh. "Perfect," he murmured. "They're finally coming to fight." His officers exchanged uncertain glances. They had expected alarm. "You don't understand," Mardonius continued, rising from his cushioned seat. "In Athens, in the mountain passes, those narrow places favor their tactics. They can hide behind their shields and hold a line forever. But out here..." He swept his arm toward the window, toward the vast Boeotian plain stretching toward the horizon. "Out here, we have room." He ordered the evacuation of Athens immediately, leaving nothing but scorched earth and bitter memory. The army fell back to a position he had selected months earlier, the flatlands near the city of Plataea, where the Asopus River crawled lazily between wheat fields and the foothills of Mount Cithaeron, rose in the south like a natural amphitheater. Here, Mardonius built his fortress. It was less a camp than a mobile city. A square mile of wooden walls, observation towers, and defensive ditches. Inside, the army established itself with the comfortable efficiency of men who had campaigned from Egypt to India. Cook fires dotted the enclosure like stars. The sound of hammers echoed day and night as engineers reinforced the palisades, and Mardonius waited, watching the southern passes for the first glint of bronze. The Greeks came like a swelling tide. First the Spartans, their scarlet cloaks visible from miles away, marching in the eerie silence that was their hallmark. Behind them came the Perioikoi, the Tegeans, the Corinthians, the Megarians, city by city, contingent by contingent, until the slopes of Mount Cithaeron bristled with spears like a forest of metal trees. By the time the full coalition assembled, over 100,000 Greeks stood arrayed against the Persian host. The two armies regarded each other across the Asopus River, close enough to see individual faces, far enough to be beyond effective bow range. Neither moved. Days passed. The Greek commanders, Pausanias of Sparta at their head, understood what Mardonius wanted. He wanted them to descend from the high ground, to cross the river, and meet him on the flat, hilling floor where his cavalry could circle and strike, until the phalanx collapsed from exhaustion. They refused. Mardonius, for his part, had no intention of charging uphill into a wall of shields. He had supplies, patience, and time. Let the Greeks roast in their armor. Let their coalition fracture under the strain of inactivity. And so the staring contest continued, silent, tense, murderous in its stillness. It was Mardonius who blinked first, though not in the way anyone expected. He didn't send his infantry. Instead, he summoned Masistius. There are men who become legends through action, and there are men who become legends simply by existing. Masistius was the second kind, a physical specimen so perfectly formed that soldiers whispered he had been touched by the gods. He stood nearly a head taller than any man in camp, his beard oiled and curled in the Median fashion, his armor a masterwork of overlapping golden scales that caught the light like dragon skin. When he rode, it was on a Nicaean stallion, the royal breed reserved for Persian nobility, with a bridle of solid gold and tack that cost more than most Greek farms. "Take your riders," Mardonius instructed him. "Make them come down. Make them angry." Masistius smiled. He understood. The Persian cavalry swept up the slopes like a bronze and gold wave, whooping and screaming insults in broken Greek. They didn't engage directly. That would have been foolish. Instead, they circled, firing arrows into the massed formations, then wheeling away before the hoplites could close the distance. It was maddening. The Megarians, positioned on an exposed flank, took the worst of it. Arrows thudded into shields, found gaps between helmets and breastplates, sent men crumpling to the dust. They couldn't advance without breaking formation. They couldn't retreat without exposing their backs. They were, quite simply, being murdered by inches. Their commander sent a desperate runner to Pausanias. "Either send reinforcements," the message read, "or we withdraw immediately." Pausanias looked around at his assembled officers. Descending from the heights to fight cavalry on open ground was tactical suicide. Who would volunteer for such a task? Silence stretched. Then a voice from the Athenian contingent. "We'll go." 300 Athenians, supported by a small force of archers, descended the slope at a dead run. They crashed into the Megarian position and immediately began hurling javelins at the circling horsemen. The skirmish devolved into a swirling melee of dust and screaming. In the chaos, no one saw the arrow that struck Masistius's horse, only the result. The magnificent stallion reared, screaming, and threw its rider. For a moment, the golden giant lay stunned on the ground, surrounded by Greeks. What followed should have been quick. It wasn't. The Athenians swarmed Masistius, stabbing and hacking, but their blades bounced off his armor as if striking stone. The golden scales were impenetrable. Masistius fought back, cutting down 2 men before he regained his feet, roaring defiance in Persian. It was an Athenian spearman who finally understood. He stepped close, inside the arc of Masistius's sword, and drove his weapon point first into the eye slit of the Persian's helmet. The golden rider fell. The Persians went mad. Cavalry charged in a desperate attempt to recover their commander's body, turning a skirmish into a full-scale battle. The fighting was savage. Men wrestled on the ground, bit and gouged, died with their hands around enemy throats. When it finally ended, the Greeks held the field and the corpse. They stripped Masistius of his armor, loaded his body onto a cart, and paraded it through the camp. Soldiers lined the paths, cheering, reaching out to touch the legendary dead. For the first time since the invasion began, Greek morale soared. But Pausanias, watching from the command tent, felt no joy. They had won a skirmish, killed a single man, however famous. Below, in the valley, 300,000 Persians still waited, and Mardonius was no longer smiling. The euphoria lasted exactly 1 day. By the following morning, the Greek army faced a more fundamental enemy than Persian steel: thirst. Their position on the high ground, chosen for its defensive advantages, had one critical flaw: no reliable water source. Pausanias made the calculation and didn't like the answer. He ordered the entire coalition to shift position, moving closer to the Asopus River and a spring called Gargaphia. It was a necessary risk, but it was still a risk. Mardonius saw the movement and understood immediately. He didn't attack. Attacking would have been crude. Instead, he issued a single, elegant order: cut their throat. His cavalry swept wide, bypassing the Greek front entirely, and struck the mountain passes behind the coalition. A supply convoy of 500 wagons, food, water, medical supplies, was intercepted and annihilated. The oxen were slaughtered. The drivers were butchered. The wagons were burned. Overnight, the Greek army went from uncomfortable to desperate. The days that followed were an exercise in psychological torture. Each morning, the sun rose hotter than the day before, beating down on men encased in 60 pounds of bronze. Each afternoon, Persian cavalry would ride up to the Asopus, just out of range, and fire arrows into the Greek lines. Not enough to cause mass casualties, but enough to kill a few men, wound a few more, and remind everyone that death was always watching. The Greeks couldn't advance without being surrounded. They couldn't retreat without appearing weak. They couldn't even fetch water from the river without dodging arrows. On the 8th day, Someone in the ranks started screaming. It wasn't pain, it was madness. He was restrained before he could run toward the Persian lines, but his breakdown sent ripples of unease through the entire coalition. The various contingents began arguing openly. The Corinthians wanted to withdraw. The Athenians demanded an attack. The Spartans maintained stony silence, trusting their regent to find a solution. But Pausanias was running out of options. On the 11th day, Mardonius delivered the killing blow. The cavalry didn't bother with arrows this time. They rode directly to the Gargaphia spring, the sole water source for 100,000 men, and simply destroyed it. Horses churned the clear water into mud. Men defecated into the pool. By the time they withdrew, the spring was a pit of undrinkable filth. That night, Pausanias called his commanders to council. "We move at midnight," he said, his voice hoarse. "We withdraw to the island." He pointed to a position on the crude map, closer to the mountain, near a secondary water source. "And we regroup." The commanders nodded grimly. There was no other choice. But as they dispersed to prepare their contingents, none of them suspected that the night ahead would bring the coalition to the brink of total disintegration. Midnight came wrapped in darkness and dread. The order to move had been clear. Total silence, perfect coordination. All contingents shifting simultaneously toward the fallback position. In theory, it was elegant. In practice, it was chaos. The center of the Greek line broke first. The Corinthians, Megarians, and their neighbors had spent days cooking under the sun, taking casualties from hit-and-run attacks, watching their water supply dwindle to nothing. When the order came to move, something snapped. They didn't withdraw in formation. They fled. Whole units abandoned their positions and sprinted toward the rear, not stopping at the designated rallying point, but continuing all the way to the town of Plataea, where they crowded around the temple of Hera, like children hiding from a thunderstorm. In the space of an hour, the Greek coalition had lost half its strength to raw panic. On the right wing, where the Spartans held position, the problem was entirely different. Amompharetus was a captain of the Pitonat Locos, one of the most prestigious units in the Spartan army. He was also, on this particular night, the most stubborn man in Greece. When Pausanias' messenger arrived with the order to withdraw, Amompharetus didn't even let him finish. "No," the messenger blinked. "Sir, the regent commands us to run from barbarians." Amompharetus turned his back. "I don't run." Pausanias arrived personally, his face tight with barely controlled fury. The argument that followed would have been comical if the stakes hadn't been so catastrophic. "This is not a retreat," Pausanias hissed. "It's a tactical repositioning. We're moving to better ground." "I know what running looks like," Amompharetus replied calmly. "I don't care what words you wrap it in. If you stay here, you die. Your men die. For nothing. Then we die as Spartans." The captain shrugged. "There are worse fates." Pausanias grabbed his arm. Amompharetus shook him off. For a long moment, the two men stared at each other, regent and captain, supreme commander and subordinate, locked in a battle of wills that had nothing to do with Persia. Then Amompharetus did something extraordinary. He bent down, seized a boulder from the riverbed, a stone so heavy it required both hands, and slammed it at Pausanias' feet. "In Sparta," he said slowly, as if explaining something to a child. "We vote with pebbles. This is my vote. I vote to stay and fight." The standoff continued for nearly an hour. While the two Spartans argued, an Athenian messenger arrived, expecting to find the retreat already underway. Instead, he found chaos. The Spartan column motionless, its commanders screaming at each other, the eastern sky beginning to lighten with the first gray hints of dawn. "What?" the messenger asked carefully. "Is happening?" Pausanias looked at him with the expression of a man who had run out of patience, solutions, and hope. "Tell your generals," he said flatly, "that we're coming, eventually." In the end, Pausanias made the only decision left to him. He ordered the main Spartan force to begin moving, leaving Amampharitus's unit behind. It was a gamble, a bet that the stubborn captain would rather swallow his pride than face 300,000 Persians alone. The bet almost failed. Amampharitus watched his countrymen march away, his jaw set, his men shifting nervously around him. For several terrible minutes, it looked like he would actually do it, actually stand his ground until the Persian tide washed over him. Then, finally, cursing under his breath, he gave the order to follow. His unit jogged to catch up with the main column, arriving just as the sun crested the mountains. Too late. Across the Esopus, the Persian sentries rubbed sleep from their eyes and stared at the Greek positions. The center was gone. The Athenians on the left flank had vanished behind the hills during the night, and there, exposed on the rolling ridges of Cithaeron, strung out in a ragged line with one unit trailing far behind the rest, were the Spartans. The sentries began to shout. Mardonius emerged from his tent, still fastening his armor. He took one look at the scene before him and began to laugh. "So much for Spartan discipline," he said. "They're running. They're actually running." He didn't wait for a battle plan. He didn't organize a careful advance. He simply pointed at the scarlet cloaks on the ridge and gave the order that would seal the fate of the Persian Empire. Get them. The Persian army did not advance. It erupted. 300,000 men surged forward like a tide released from some divine dam, their war cries merging into a single continuous roar that echoed off the mountainsides. The ground itself seemed to tremble beneath the thunder of hooves and the pounding of countless feet. Mardonius rode at the front, his white stallion dancing with barely contained energy, his purple cloak streaming behind him like a battle standard. Around him, the immortals kept pace. 10,000 of Persia's finest warriors, their wicker shields locked, their spears leveled, running with the terrifying synchronization of men who had trained together for decades. Behind them came the rest, Medes in their scaled armor, Bactrians with their distinctive curved bows, Saka horse archers already knocking arrows as they galloped, and the Greek collaborators from Thebes and other turncoat cities, their bronze equipment marking them as traitors to their own blood. The dust rose in a choking cloud that obscured the sun. Pausanias heard them before he saw them. He turned, still marching up the ridge toward the fallback position, and watched the horizon fill with death. His column was strung out over nearly a mile of broken terrain, completely wrong for receiving a charge. Amampharitus's unit was still jogging to catch up, dangerously exposed on the lower slopes. The Athenians on the left flank were too far away to help. The center had fled to Plataea. He was alone with perhaps 11,000 Spartans and Tegeans against the full fury of the Persian Empire. For one terrible moment, the regent of Sparta felt something he had never experienced in his life: despair. Then training took over. "Halt!" His voice cut through the chaos like a blade. "Form line! Shields up!" The column stopped. Spartiates, who had been marching in loose formation, suddenly compressed, shields overlapping, spears bristling outward like the quills of some enormous bronze hedgehog. The Tegeans on the flank did the same, their discipline nearly matching that of their Spartan allies. It wasn't enough. Pausanias knew it wasn't enough. They were caught in the open, barely formed up, about to receive the charge of an army that outnumbered them 30 to 1. But there was one thing left to do, one ritual that could not be skipped, no matter the circumstances. He called for a priest. The sacrifice that followed would become legend. As Persian arrows began to fall, first a scattered few, then hundreds, then thousands, Pausanias turned his back on the enemy. He ordered a white goat brought forward, drew his knife, and prepared to read the will of the gods. Around him, men were dying. The Persian archers had planted their wicker shields in a long wall and begun firing in coordinated volleys. The arrows rose in dark clouds, hung at the apex of their flight for a breathless moment, then plunged down onto the Greek formation like iron rain. The Spartans raised their shields and endured. Thud, thud, thud. Each impact sent vibrations up the arm, jarring the shoulder, testing the grip. A man 2 positions to the left grunted and fell. An arrow had found the gap between his helmet and breastplate, burying itself in his neck. He died trying to stand back up. Another man screamed as a shaft punched through the bronze facing of his shield and into his forearm, pinning his arm to the interior. He kept his position in line, teeth clenched, blood running down to his elbow. And still, Pausanias did not give the order to charge. The goat's throat was cut. Its blood spilled onto the dusty ground. The priest examined the liver with trembling hands while arrows whispered past his ears. "The omens," he said, his voice cracking, "are unfavorable." Pausanias closed his eyes. Again. Behind the Spartan line, the Helots were dying in droves. These were the slaves of Sparta, men whose ancestors had been conquered generations ago, who worked Spartan fields and served Spartan masters, who had been dragged to this battlefield not as warriors, but as support troops. They had no bronze armor. Many had no shields at all, only wicker targets or stretched animal hides that arrows punched through like wet paper. They huddled behind their masters, trying to use the armored Spartiates as cover. But there was no cover from a storm. Arrows found them in their backs, their legs, their upturned faces. They died in heaps, their blood mixing with that of the Greeks they served. For them, this was not a battle for freedom. This was dying for masters who despised them, in a war they had not chosen, on land that was not their home. Some of them screamed. Some prayed to gods who did not answer. Most simply closed their eyes and waited for the darkness. The most tragic casualty of those terrible minutes was a Spartiate named Callicrates. Herodotus would later record that he was the most beautiful man in the Greek army. Not merely handsome, but physically perfect in the way the Greeks idealized. A living statue of bronze muscle and classical proportion. He had marched to Plataea expecting glory. He found only frustration. The arrow that killed him struck from an angle. slipping past his raised shield and burying itself in his side, just below the ribs. It was not immediately fatal. It was worse than that. He felt the iron point grate against bone, felt the hot rush of blood inside his body, and knew with absolute certainty that he was dying. They carried him to the rear as the arrows continued to fall. He was still conscious, still aware, still furious. "I do not grieve for death," he whispered to the man holding his hand. "I grieve that I die without having struck a single blow. My hands are clean. They should be red." He was still speaking when his eyes went glassy. Pausanias cut the throat of another goat. The liver was inspected. The priest shook his head. Unfavorable. Around them, the Persian infantry had begun to advance. They could see individual faces now, bearded warriors in quilted armor, their wicker shields held high, their bows replaced by spears and short swords. The distance was closing. Soon it would be hand to hand, and the Greeks were still locked in place, forbidden to move by divine prohibition. The Tegeans began to shift. Their commander pushed his way toward Pausanias, his face red with fury. "We cannot wait any longer. My men are being slaughtered. We wait for the gods. The gods are watching us die." Pausanias did not respond. He was staring at the distant temple of Hera, barely visible on a hill to the northwest. Tears, actual tears, were streaming down his face, cutting channels through the dust and grime of battle. He was praying. Not the formal prayers of ritual, but something rawer. A desperate plea from a man who had run out of human options and was begging for divine intervention. "Mother of the gods," he whispered, "do not let us die in shame. Not like this, not without fighting. Give us the sign. Give us the sign." A third goat was brought forward. The knife flashed. The blood flowed. The priest bent over the entrails, his hands shaking so badly he could barely hold the liver. Then he looked up, and his expression transformed. "Favorable," he breathed. "The omens are favorable." Pausanias rose. He did not shout a command. He did not deliver a speech. He simply lifted his spear, a gesture visible to every man in the line, and pointed it at the enemy. The Spartans understood. 11,000 men who had spent an eternity crouched beneath their shields, absorbing punishment, watching their brothers die without response, suddenly released every ounce of suppressed rage in a single, explosive movement. They charged. The collision was apocalyptic. The Persian archer line, that careful construction of planted shields and disciplined volleys, had been designed to break infantry charges through sheer attrition. Fire enough arrows into an advancing formation, and eventually men would falter, stumble, rout. They had not accounted for the Spartans. The scarlet tide slammed into the wicker wall with a sound like the end of the world, a splintering, crunching, screaming cacophony that carried for miles. The lightweight Persian shields, so effective against arrows, simply disintegrated under the impact of bronze-faced Aspis shields backed by 200 pounds of armored muscle, moving at a dead run. The front rank of Persian archers didn't fall. They were launched backward, their bodies striking their comrades behind them, creating a cascading wave of chaos that rippled through the formation. And into that chaos poured the fury of Greece. The battle entered the phase the Greeks called othismos, the push. In phalanx warfare, this was the critical moment. The point where two masses of men pressed against each other, shield to shield, and tried to physically shove the enemy backward through sheer collective force. But this was not phalanx against phalanx. This was bronze against cloth. The immortals were brave. Let no historian ever claim otherwise. These were men who had conquered nations, who had stormed the pass at Thermopylae, who had never known defeat. They threw themselves at the Spartan line with desperate courage, grabbing spear shafts and trying to snap them, ducking under shields to stab at exposed legs, fighting with the ferocity of cornered wolves. But courage does not stop physics. The Spartans were encased in bronze, greaves protecting their shins, breastplates covering their torsos, helmets obscuring everything but their eyes and mouths. When a Persian blade struck a Spartan, it skittered across curved metal and glanced away. When a Spartan spear struck a Persian, it punched through linen padding and into flesh. The mathematics were brutal and simple. The killing began in earnest when the spears broke. 20 minutes into the othismos, most of the long ash shafts had been snapped by the sheer pressure of combat, grabbed by Persian hands, stepped on by stumbling feet, shattered against shields and armor. The Greeks drew their secondary weapons, the xiphos, a short leaf-shaped sword designed for exactly this kind of close-quarters butchery. The Spartan method was mechanical, almost industrial. Stab to the face. The blade would find the gap between cheek guard and neck guard on an enemy helmet, or for the unarmored Persians, simply bury itself in the cheek, the eye, the throat. Bash with the shield rim. The bronze-edged aspis became a weapon in itself, driven forward into Persian faces, breaking noses and jaws, stunning enemies long enough for the follow-up thrust. Step forward over the corpse. Take the space the dead man had occupied. Force the enemy back another foot. Repeat. The helots, no longer passive victims of the arrow storm, swarmed into the gaps between Spartan formations. They carried javelins, slings, and knives, light weapons that couldn't breach Persian armor, but could finish off the wounded who lay groaning in the dust. They moved through the carnage like jackals following lions, ending lives that the Spartans had begun. The ground became treacherous, slick with blood, and cluttered with bodies. Men stumbled over the dead and were trampled by the living. The dust rose in choking clouds, mixing with the iron stench of opened bellies until the air itself seemed to taste of death. In the center of this hell, Mardonius fought like a god of war. His white stallion had been killed in the initial collision, speared through the chest by some anonymous Spartan whose name history did not record. But the Persian general had landed on his feet, sword in hand, and had immediately begun killing. He was surrounded by his personal guard, 1,000 hand-picked warriors, the best of the best, sworn to die before letting harm reach their commander. They formed a living fortress around him, shields interlocked, moving as a single organism through the chaos. Mardonius himself was magnificent. He stood taller than most of his soldiers, his gilded armor flashing whenever the dust cleared enough to admit sunlight. He moved with the fluid grace of a lifetime warrior, his blade a silver blur that left red ruin wherever it touched. Spartans fell before him. Not many, but more than should have been possible for a single man. His presence was magnetic. As long as the Persians could see that gilded figure standing tall amid the carnage, they fought on. They told themselves that the battle could still be won. They convinced themselves that one more push, one more effort, would turn the tide. They were wrong. Pausanias saw him. Across the bloody chaos of the melee, the Spartan regent spotted the glittering Persian general. Unmistakable, irreplaceable, the heart and brain of the enemy army. He didn't need to give an order. The Spartans sensed it instinctively, the way wolves sense weakness in their prey. The phalanx began to shift its weight, applying pressure not randomly but directionally, grinding toward the cluster of elite guards that surrounded Mardonius. The 1,000-man bodyguard fought with suicidal determination. They knew what the Spartans wanted. They threw themselves into the bronze wall again and again, spending their lives to buy their general another minute, another second. It wasn't enough. The circle shrank. 800 guards, 600, 400. The corpses piled so high around Mardonius that his surviving men were fighting from atop a rampart of their fallen brothers. 200, 100, 50. And then a Spartan named Arimnestos, the one who is remembered, saw his moment. The spear thrust was almost anticlimactic. Arimnestos had been fighting for what felt like hours, his arm aching, his shield dented in a dozen places, blood running from a shallow cut on his thigh. He was tired. He was thirsty. He wanted nothing more than to sit down and drink clean water. But there, suddenly, was Mardonius. The Persian general was still fighting, still killing, but he was also visibly flagging. His movements had slowed. His guard had shrunk to a handful of men. And for one brief heartbeat, his attention was focused elsewhere, on a threat approaching from his left. Arimnestos didn't hesitate. He planted his back foot, drove forward with every ounce of remaining strength, and sent his spear punching into Mardonius's chest. The golden armor, so beautiful, so expensive, so utterly useless against a proper war spear, crumpled like parchment. The iron point slid between ribs, through lung, and emerged from the Persian's back in a spray of crimson. Mardonius looked down at the shaft protruding from his chest. He looked up at the Spartan who had killed him. He tried to say something, some final defiance, some last curse, but his mouth filled with blood, and the only sound that emerged was a wet gurgle. Then his knees buckled, and the man who had burned Athens fell face first into the dirt of Boeotia. The Persian army died with him, not all at once, not cleanly, but the death was unmistakable. The roar of battle, which had been continuous for hours, suddenly changed in pitch. The aggressive Persian war cries faltered, replaced by something higher and more desperate, the sound of men realizing they had lost. The immortals, those legendary warriors who had never retreated, broke. They turned and ran, not in formation, not with discipline, but in raw animal panic. They threw down their shields to run faster. They trampled their own wounded in their desperation to escape. The proud regiments that had terrorized the world dissolved into a mob of terrified individuals, each man thinking only of himself. The Greeks followed. Miles away, watching from a hillside with 40,000 fresh troops under his command, the Persian general Artabazus made his decision. He had never liked Mardonius. He had counseled against this battle, against this entire campaign. He had warned that the Greeks were more dangerous than they appeared, that victory was not certain, that prudence demanded caution. No one had listened. Now Mardonius was dead. The army was routing, and Artabazus had a choice to make. He could lead his reserves into the battle, potentially turn the tide, die gloriously in the attempt. Or he could leave. He thought of his estates back in Persia, his wives, his children, the comfortable life that awaited him if he simply turned his horse around. "We march north," he said quietly. His officers stared at him. "Sir, the battle is lost. We march north. Anyone who disagrees can stay here and die." No one disagreed. 40,000 Persian soldiers, fresh, unbloodied, potentially decisive, turned their backs on their countrymen and walked away. They would not stop walking until they reached the Hellespont. Months later, having abandoned the entire army to its fate. It was the coldest betrayal in the history of the Persian Wars. The surviving Persians had one hope left: the fortified camp. They streamed toward it in a river of desperate humanity. Cavalry who had lost their horses, infantry who had thrown away their weapons, officers who had abandoned their units. The massive wooden walls rose before them like the promise of salvation. The gates swung open. Men poured inside. The gates slammed shut. For a few precious minutes, the Persians believed they were safe. The stockade was enormous, a square mile of fortifications designed by the best military engineers in the world. The walls were thick. The towers were manned. Surely the Greeks couldn't breach such defenses. They had forgotten something important. The Greeks weren't just Spartans. Pausanias arrived at the walls of the stockade to find his men milling in frustration. The Spartans were many things: disciplined, deadly, unstoppable in open battle. But they were not engineers. Siege warfare required specialized knowledge, specialized equipment, specialized training. The Spartans had none of these things. They paced before the wooden walls like caged animals, occasionally throwing javelins that bounced harmlessly off the timber, glaring at the Persian archers who had resumed firing from the safety of the towers. The battle had become a stalemate. And then the Athenians arrived. They came at a run. 8,000 hoplites who had spent the morning fighting Greek collaborators on the other flank. They had won that engagement decisively, scattering the traitors and pursuing them until word reached their commanders that the real battle was at the stockade. Now they were here, and they were angry. The Athenians had lost more than any other Greek city. Their temples had been burned. Their homes had been razed. Their sacred olive trees, planted by the goddess Athena herself, according to legend, had been chopped down and used for Persian campfires. They wanted blood. More importantly, they knew how to take a wall. The Athenian engineers assessed the stockade with professional eyes. The Persians had built well, but they had built quickly. The timbers were thick, but not reinforced with stone. The corners were the weak points, the places where sections of wall met and created natural stress fractures. "There," the lead engineer said, pointing. "We go through there." The Athenians organized themselves with terrifying efficiency. Shields locked above their heads in a testudo formation. They advanced toward the wall in a slow, inexorable crawl. Arrows rained down on them, but the overlapping bronze deflected most of the missiles. When they reached the wall, they didn't try to climb it. They started taking it apart. Axes bit into the timbers. Ropes were attached to protruding beams. Teams of men hauled backward, using leverage and collective strength to pull the structure apart, piece by piece. The Persians on the walls stabbed downward with spears, poured boiling water, threw everything they could find. But the Athenians kept working. The wall groaned, it sagged, and then, with a splintering crash that could be heard across the battlefield, a 20-foot section collapsed outward. What happened next was not a battle. The Spartans poured through the breach like water through a broken dam. Behind them came the Tegeans, the Corinthians, who had finally emerged from their hiding place near the temple, the Megarians, and every other Greek contingent that had spent the day fighting or fleeing. Inside the stockade, there was nowhere to run. The Persians were packed together so tightly they could barely raise their arms to defend themselves. The Greeks pushed into them, shields forward, blades working, and began the methodical work of extermination. This was not warfare. This was butchery. The frustration of Thermopylae, the rage over the burning of Athens, the terror of the thirsty nights on the mountain, the humiliation of the cavalry raids, all of it poured out now in an orgy of violence that would haunt the survivors for the rest of their lives. Spartans waded through the press, their Xyphos blades rising and falling with mechanical regularity. Athenians fought with a savagery born of personal loss, screaming the names of dead relatives as they killed. Even the Helots joined in, stabbing and slashing with their crude knives, taking vengeance on the masters who had once enslaved their ancestors. The Persians begged for mercy in a dozen languages. No mercy came. The killing continued until exhaustion forced it to stop. By late afternoon, the interior of the stockade had been transformed into a charnel house. Bodies lay in heaps so deep that the living had to climb over mountains of the dead. The ground was a swamp of mud and blood that reached past the ankles. The stench, already rising in the August heat, was a physical presence, thick enough to taste. Of the nearly 260,000 Persians who had begun the day under Mardonius's command, not counting Artabazus' deserters, ancient sources claim that only 3,000 survived to be taken prisoner. The number is almost certainly exaggerated, but standing in that stockade, surrounded by the horror of what they had done, even the Greeks could not believe what they had accomplished. The Persian Empire had come to Greece with more soldiers than most people would see in a lifetime. The Greeks had killed them all. Pausanias walked through the ruins of Mardonius's tent in a daze. He was still covered in gore, other men's blood drying to a brown crust on his armor, his cloak torn and stained, his sword hand cramping from hours of killing. He had not eaten since the previous night. He had not drunk water since the spring was fouled. But none of that seemed to matter as he stared at the treasures surrounding him. The tent was less a military shelter than a mobile palace. Silk hangings embroidered with golden thread, couches stuffed with feathers from birds that didn't exist in Greece, tables of carved ebony inlaid with silver, chests, dozens of chests, overflowing with gold derricks, the coin of the Persian realm. One chest contained nothing but jewelry: arm rings, finger rings, neck chains, ear ornaments, enough gold to purchase a small city. Another held nothing but drinking vessels, gold cups, silver pitchers, bronze mixing bowls of such exquisite craftsmanship that Pausanias could only stare at them in wonder. This had been Mardonius's traveling kit, his basic accommodations, his roughing-it equipment. The man who had lived amid this splendor now lay outside in the dirt, his chest opened by a Spartan spear, his golden armor being stripped by looters. A strange impulse seized Pausanias. He found the Persian cooks cowering in a corner of the pavilion. Slaves, probably, who had expected to be killed alongside their masters. Instead of ordering their execution, Pausanias pointed at the cooking equipment and gave an order. Prepare a meal, the same meal you would have prepared for your general tonight. The cooks stared at him. Now, they scrambled to obey. What emerged over the next hour was a feast beyond anything the Spartans had ever imagined. Roasted lamb stuffed with dates and almonds, soft white bread still steaming from the oven, honeyed pastries dusted with crushed pistachios, wine so rich and sweet it tasted like liquid fruit. The smells filled the tent: saffron, roasting fat, exotic spices that had traveled thousands of miles from the distant east. Pausanias watched it all being prepared. Then he called over his own Spartan mess servants and gave a second order. Prepare a standard Spartan dinner. The servants looked at him as if he had lost his mind. But they obeyed. The Spartan meal was ready in minutes. It required no preparation beyond throwing ingredients into a pot. Pork blood, vinegar, and lentils, boiled into a thick black sludge that visitors to Sparta called the worst food in the civilized world. According to legend, a foreign dignitary had once tasted the famous black broth and declared, "Now I understand why Spartans don't fear death. Anything is better than eating this." Pausanias placed the two meals side by side on Mardonius's silver table. On one side, the culinary height of the greatest empire the world had ever known. On the other, a bowl of brown sludge. He called his commanders into the tent. The men who filed in were exhausted, wounded, blood-spattered survivors of the worst day of their lives. They stared at the contrasting meals with the dull incomprehension of soldiers who had pushed past the limits of human endurance. Pausanias let them stare. Then he began to laugh. It started as a chuckle, building into something loud and slightly unhinged. The laughter of a man who had seen too much, who stood at the edge of madness and found the abyss somehow hilarious. "Look at this," he gasped, gesturing at the Persian feast. "Look at what the leader of the Medes ate every single night. This is how he lived. Soft beds, slave cooks, golden cups for his wine. He had everything." He pointed at the black broth. "And look at what we eat. Look at what we consider luxury. We have nothing." He swept his arm across the tent, taking in the silk and silver and gold. And yet this man, who had all of this, came across the world to rob us, of the little we possess. The laughter faded. Pausanias's expression grew strange, complicated, unreadable. "What kind of fool," he asked quietly, "leaves paradise to steal from the poor?" The question hung in the air. But even as Pausanias spoke the words, something shifted behind his eyes. He looked at the gold. He looked at the silk. He looked at the feast laid out before him, and his commanders would later swear they saw hunger there, not for food, but for something far more dangerous. The man who mocked the feast was falling in love with it. On the same day, some accounts say the same hour, another battle was being fought across the Aegean Sea. The Greek fleet, emboldened by rumors of the land campaign, had sailed to the coast of Asia Minor. At a place called Mycale, they found the remnants of the Persian navy beached on the shore. their ships pulled up onto the sand and protected by a fortified camp. The Greeks attacked. The battle was shorter and less storied than Plataea, but equally decisive. The Persian garrison was slaughtered. The ships were burned. The flames rose so high that sailors on distant islands thought a new volcano had erupted. By sunset, the Persian Empire had lost its army and its navy on the same day. The war was over. Greece was free. And the consequences would poison everything they had fought for. The alliance that had saved Greece began to fracture before the blood was dry. Athens went home as heroes, their navy now the most powerful force in the Greek world. They rebuilt their walls, bigger than before. They constructed a massive fleet, more ships than any Greek city had ever possessed. They formed the Delian League, ostensibly a defensive alliance against future Persian aggression, and began demanding contributions from island states across the Aegean. Within a generation, the Athenian alliance had become an Athenian empire. The freedom they had fought for at Plataea was monetized, weaponized, transformed into a tool of domination. The tribute that once flowed to Persia now flowed to Athens. The subject states that once feared the great king now feared Athenian triremes. History has a cruel sense of irony. But the darkest shadow fell not on Athens. It fell on the man who had made victory possible. Pausanias returned to Sparta as the greatest hero his city had ever produced. He had commanded the largest Greek army ever assembled. He had killed the Persian general with his own forces. He had avenged Thermopylae, liberated Greece, and proven to the world that free men could defeat a tyranny. He should have lived out his days in honored retirement, his name spoken with reverence for generations. Instead, he went mad. It happened slowly, then all at once. The first reports reached the ephors from distant campaigns. Pausanias had been sent abroad to continue operations against Persian holdings in the Aegean. The work should have been simple: liberation of Greek cities, suppression of remaining collaborators. Instead, strange rumors began to filter back. Travelers claimed that the regent no longer dressed like a Spartan. The rough red cloak had been replaced by the flowing purple robes of a Persian satrap. The simple bronze armor had given way to gilded ceremonial plate. He traveled not with a modest retinue of Spartan soldiers, but with a personal bodyguard of Egyptians and Persians, foreign mercenaries who answered only to him. He no longer ate black broth. The feast he had mocked at Plataea had become his daily fare. He employed Persian cooks, slept on Persian cushions, drank from the very gold cups he had once held up as symbols of enemy decadence. Worse, far worse, were the whispers about letters. Secret correspondence, they said, carried by trusted messengers to the distant Persian court. Some claimed that Pausanias was negotiating with Xerxes himself, offering to deliver all of Greece into Persian hands in exchange for the king's daughter in marriage. The savior of Greek civilization was becoming a traitor. The ephors recalled him to Sparta. Pausanias came home willingly, arrogantly, confident that his reputation would protect him from any consequence. When they put him on trial, he defended himself with the skill of a man who had once commanded the respect of nations. There was no hard evidence. The letters could not be produced. The witnesses were unreliable. The charges were dismissed. Pausanias should have learned from the experience. He should have moderated his behavior, returned to Spartan traditions, remembered who he was and where he came from. He did none of these things. Instead, he grew bolder. He continued his intrigues, continued his correspondence, continued his transformation into the very enemy he had once destroyed. And then he made the fatal mistake. Conspiring with Persia was dangerous. Conspiring with the Helots was unforgivable. The rumors spread through Sparta like wildfire. Pausanias was promising freedom to the slaves. He was recruiting them for some shadowy purpose, perhaps an army, perhaps a rebellion, perhaps a coup that would make him tyrant of Sparta. For the ephors, this was different from the Persian letters. The Persian letters threatened Greece in the abstract. The Helot conspiracy threatened the Spartan way of life directly. The Helots outnumbered the Spartiates 7-1. The only thing preventing a slave uprising was fear, the knowledge that rebellion meant annihilation. If someone promised the Helots freedom, offered them weapons and leadership, the entire Spartan system could collapse overnight. Pausanias had to be stopped. The ephors set their trap with the cold precision that characterized Spartan governance. They found a servant who had carried messages for Pausanias, a man who was terrified enough to cooperate. They told him to request a meeting with the regent, to ask for proof that his dangerous service would be rewarded. A hiding place was prepared behind a partition in the meeting room. When Pausanias arrived, he found only his nervous servant. The conversation that followed was damning. Explicit discussion of Helot recruitment, promises of revolution, casual references to Persian assistance. Behind the partition, the ephors listened to every word. The evidence was irrefutable. Pausanias must have sensed the change in the wind. Perhaps the servant had shown his nervousness too openly. Perhaps a friend in the government had warned him. Perhaps he simply possessed the survival instincts of a man who had fought too many battles. Whatever the reason, when the ephors came for him, he was already running. He sprinted through the streets of Sparta, the greatest general in the world, reduced to a fugitive in his own city. Citizens stopped and stared as he passed. Children pointed, dogs barked. He ran until he reached the temple of Athena, of the Brazen House. The great bronze doors swung open at his touch. He stumbled inside, gasping, and threw himself at the feet of the goddess's statue. Sanctuary. In the ancient world, a man who claimed sanctuary in a temple could not be killed without bringing divine wrath upon his murderers. The ephors would have to wait him out, negotiate, or let him go. The ephors arrived moments later. They stood at the temple doors, staring at the man who had once saved their civilization. They could not enter with swords. They could not drag him out. And so they made a decision that would echo through history. The order was simple: seal the entrance. Workers were summoned with stones and mortar. If the ephors could not remove Pausanias from the temple, they would simply ensure he never left. Word spread through the city. Citizens gathered to watch the extraordinary spectacle. The hero of Plataea being walled into a tomb while still breathing. And then an old woman pushed through the crowd. She was small and weathered, her face lined by decades of Spartan hardship. She walked with the stiff dignity of age, her eyes fixed on the temple doors. The crowd parted for her. They knew who she was. She reached the threshold of the temple, the place where her son crouched in the darkness, listening to the sounds of his own imprisonment being constructed. For a long moment, she stood there. Then she bent down, picked up a stone from the ground, and placed it carefully on the threshold. She did not speak. She did not weep. She did not look back. She simply turned and walked away, leaving her stone behind, her vote, cast in the Spartan manner for her son's death. The workers continued their labor. Stone by stone, the doorway disappeared. The light inside the temple faded. The sounds of the outside world grew muffled, then silent. Pausanias sat in the darkness of his divine prison and listened to his own breathing. Days passed. The incense in the temple, left from the last ceremony, slowly faded. The air grew stale. His throat burned with thirst. His stomach cramped with hunger. He had time to think, far too much time. He thought about Mardonius, dying in the dirt at Plataea, his golden armor worthless against Spartan iron. He thought about the feast in the Persian tent, the silk and silver he had mocked, while his heart ached to possess them. He thought about all the choices that had led him to this moment, trapped in a temple, abandoned by his mother, dying inch by inch in the sacred darkness. Had it been worth it? The gold, the purple robes, the taste of empire, had any of it been worth this end? He had no answer. The ephors waited outside, checking daily for sounds of movement within. On the final day, when the faint noise of breathing ceased, they moved quickly. The wall was partially dismantled, just enough to reach inside and drag out the emaciated body before it could die on holy ground and pollute the temple. Pausanias was still technically alive when they pulled him into the sunlight. He died moments later, blinking at a sun he could no longer see, his final breaths rattling in a throat parched beyond recovery. The hero of Plataea was buried without ceremony, his name struck from the rolls of the honored dead, his memory officially condemned. But memories are harder to erase than inscriptions. This is why we tell stories about Thermopylae. At Thermopylae, the 300 die beautifully. They fight against impossible odds. They fall with their shields in their hands, and they become immortal in their mortality. They never live long enough to be corrupted. They never taste the poison of victory. They remain forever pure, forever noble, forever young. Pausanias lived, he won, and victory destroyed him more thoroughly than any Persian spear. But we must not forget the truth. Thermopylae was a symbol. It was a beautiful gesture, a noble sacrifice, a moral victory in the shadow of military defeat. Plataea was salvation. It was at Plataea, on those blood-soaked plains, amid the screaming and the slaughter and the terrible mathematics of mass death, that 10,000 Spartans and their allies did what Lycidas could not. They didn't just delay the apocalypse. They ended it. They proved that free men, fighting for their homes and their laws and their right to govern themselves, could break the back of a global superpower. They showed that discipline and courage and the willingness to bleed could triumph over unlimited resources and overwhelming numbers. It was brutal. It was savage. It was necessary. So the next time you hear the story of the 300 Spartans, remember the thousands who came after. Remember the night march gone wrong, the stubborn captain with his boulder, the hour spent crouching under arrows while the priests cut goat after goat. Remember the othismos, the push, the grinding advance through walls of Persian dead. Remember Arimnestos driving his spear through Mardonius's chest. Remember the slaughter in the stockade, the price paid in blood and sanity for the freedom we inherit. And remember Pausanias. Remember the man who saved civilization and then watched it corrupt him. Remember the hero who became a traitor. Remember the mother who placed the first stone. Because history is not a story of pure heroes and simple villains. It is a record of complicated men making terrible choices under impossible pressure. Some of those men rise to the moment. Some of them are broken by it. Most of them are both, in different measures, at different times. The 300 who died at Thermopylae gave Greece a legend to fight for. The 10,000 who survived Plataea gave Greece a future to live in. Both matter. Both deserve to be remembered. The dust has long since settled on the plains of Boeotia. The bones of the fallen have crumbled to powder. The great Persian Empire that once threatened to swallow the world has itself been swallowed by time. But on quiet nights, they say, you can still hear echoes from that ancient field. The clash of bronze, the screaming of the dying, and perhaps, if you listen very carefully, the sound of a stone being placed on a threshold. The price of freedom, paid in full.